just take a few seconds to see if our live stream is working, and we'll begin this webinar shortly. My name is Aditi, and I will be hosting this webinar for the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, or HRMI, as we call ourselves for short. We are an independent, not-for-profit global data platform that is working to power a human rights revolution by developing some world-changing data tools. We measure human rights performance of nearly all the countries in the world for various rights, a range of rights defined under international law. All our data is freely available on our rights tracker for anyone in the world to use and explore. Last week, we had an amazing global data launch of our brand new human rights data. In this particular webinar, we will focus exclusively on our new economic and social rights scores, but we will also hear some interesting perspectives on how to use these data in practice for more tangible outcomes such as economic growth or for making investment decisions. As participants continue to arrive, I will just go ahead with some housekeeping bits and pieces. We have an active Q&A function that will be on throughout the webinar. So we encourage you to ask us any questions that you may have, either for the HRMI team or for any of our panelists. This session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel soon after we end this webinar today. However, only those of us who are speaking will be visible. As we go through the data and talk more about it, please feel free to view the data on your own screen. It's now live on rightstracker.org. You can also find the links in the chat box. If you want to know more about our work, you can follow us on social media. We are on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and all our social media links will also be up in the chat box. We are absolutely glad to have all of you here today from different parts of the world, drawn together by a common commitment of wanting to improve people's lives and to really make our world a fairer and a better place. So a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Just to run through what we will be talking about today, we will first take a brief tour of how to understand HRMI's new economic and social rights data. And then we have a brilliant lineup of panelists who will actually speak with us about a wide gamut of issues. We first have with us Dr. Susan Randolph, HRMI's co-founder and our economics and social rights metrics lead, who will give us an overview of her observations and trends in the new economic and social rights data. We will then talk to Dr. Elizabeth Kiletsky, who's an assistant professor of economics at Ithaca College and is actually co-leading HRMI's new work stream on child rights. Basically, Liz will help us understand the rather contested relationship between human rights on the one hand and economic growth on the other. And we also have a very special guest who has joined us in today's webinar, Mr. Brian Guhry, a senior financial sector specialist with the World Bank. Brian works in the long-term finance global unit of the Finance, Competitiveness, and Innovative Global Practice. And his role is to provide policy advice on government debt management, bond market, and capital market development issues. Brian can help us really unpack and unravel how economic and social rights fulfillment can help drive investments, particularly in low-income countries. So those are some really wide range of issues that we will be discussing today. As I mentioned, the new 2023 data was launched last week and is now live on the rights tracker. We at HRMI produce robust numbers to basically show how well governments around the world are treating their people. And the motto underlying our work is pretty simple because we firmly believe that what gets measured gets improved. Over the years, HRMI has measured about 13 different human rights defined under international law, including 5 economic and social rights. And we are expanding our data coverage every year. Since the focus of today's webinar is the economic and social rights data, HRMI measures a total of 5 economic and social rights. They are the right to education, the right to food, right to health, housing, and work. Now, measuring economic and social rights has been slightly tricky because their fulfillment is essentially related to a country's income. The threshold of obligation under international law is called progressive realization, which basically means that every country has a duty to do the best that it can with what it already has and to get better and better over time. Now, we can't possibly expect a country in the income bracket of, let's say, low and middle income countries, such as, let's say, Bangladesh or Cambodia, to have the same health system as a relatively richer country like Canada or Australia due to paucity of income and resources. However, each country still has the duty to do the best that it can for its people within its available resources. Hermes' unique methodology allows us to measure this progressive realization. Now, to better understand how we measure economic and social rights, we will just walk you through a very short video to introduce our methodology. I will stop sharing my screen and I will invite my colleague Yo-Yo to share the video with all of you so that we can go ahead with the conversation. Over to you, Yo-Yo.
Human rights release human potential. How do we tell if countries are respecting people's human rights and allowing them to flourish? If we want leaders to prioritize human rights, we need to measure them. What gets measured gets improved. Leaders of countries love numbers. What's GDP growth this quarter? How many people are out of a job? But do leaders have all the most important numbers? The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, HRMI, is filling a gap in the human rights ecosystem. We use award-winning and peer-reviewed methodologies to track the human rights performance of countries and publish scores each year on our rights tracker. We want countries to strive to climb to the top, to do their very best. We want leaders to call in their advisors and ask what they need to do to get their human rights scores up. But where is the top? When it comes to the rights to education, food, health, housing, and work, what target should a country aim for, especially when every country has a different level of income to spend? International human rights law says that every country needs to do their very best to devote their maximum available resources to improving their people's quality of life. This is called progressive realization. HRMI's scores are the first in the world to measure progressive realization, so countries at any level of income can know how well they're doing and have a realistic target to aim for, a goal they're capable of reaching. We discover the realistic target by finding out which countries have the best results at every level of income and comparing each country to that benchmark. We do it like this. Let's take the percentage of young people enrolled in secondary school in every country around the world. We take all the results for the last 20 years and plot them on this graph. Each dot is one country's result for 1 year. There's a big range. At any level of income, for rich countries and poor ones, there are some places that are setting the target, doing the best we've ever seen, and some that are a long way behind. How close to the target is a country getting? That's the HRMI score, given as a percentage of the target. Every country should be able to get near its 100% target. The lower the score, the more urgent the need for improvement. A low-income country getting 100% will most likely need more resources to improve its people's lives further. You can take these scores to government leaders. Show Guatemala's government that they are far behind other countries with the same level of wealth, even among their local neighbors. Show Malaysia that at their high level of income, they could achieve so much more. You can even combine our scores with population data to show, for instance, that if Guatemala went from its current score to the target of 100%, over 1 million extra young people would be in secondary school. Human rights release human potential and let people flourish. You can harness the power of HRMI's economic and social rights scores to fuel your country's climb to the top, its quest to be its very best. Go to rightstracker.org now.
Thank you so much for that, Yo-Yo. So basically, HRMI scores quantify how well a country is converting its income into good human rights outcomes for its people. And in just a minute, we will just go to the rights tracker to see how we do that, or to see just an example of how to explain HRMI scores. So I will just share my screen. I hope you can all see my screen now. You can go to rightstracker.org and you will land on our webpage. Now, HRMI data is sorted in many different ways, and you can explore it on the basis of the different rights we measure or countries that we measure these scores for. But most commonly, you can just use this search bar to look for a particular country or a particular right that you want to know more about. Now, since we'll be discussing economic and social rights, let's take a country example and let's go with Mozambique as an example. So I will type Mozambique here and we will go to the country page. Yeah. As we go to the country page, we land on our first tab, which is the at a glance page, which gives you a snapshot summary of the human rights landscape in the country, as well as an overview of all our scores for the different rights we measure for that country. The different rights we measure are categorized into three different groups. But since we are talking about economic and social rights, let's go to quality of life. As we go on the quality of life tab, the first thing you will see is a graph which shows Hermes scores for Mozambique for the 5 economic and social rights we measure: the rights to education, food, health, housing, and work. And we also see an aggregate summary score of all these 5 rights right here. Now, these rights are given in the form of percentages and are on an income adjusted benchmark. We just heard in the video that because our scores are adjusted for income, any score that is lower than 100 or not even close to 100 basically shows that a government is underperforming or not optimally using its income to fulfill the economic and social rights of its people at the level that it is obliged to. So the way we read it, Mozambique's summary score for quality of rights is 72.2%, which means the government of Mozambique is doing 72.2% of what we measure is possible for it to do, or it is capable to do at its existing level of income. So this gap that you see is where we can say that the government of Mozambique is falling short. Just to clarify on how to read these scores. Now, if you look at 72.2% and consider thinking of it as a test score, it may come across as a good score. However, we interpret or read these scores as completion of a task. And an example my colleague often gives is if my mother tonight wants me to do some dishes and an hour later she comes back and I tell her that I have done 72.2% of the dishes, she will not be pleased because I am capable of doing 100, but I have only done 72.2%. This is what we call the income adjusted score. Similarly, you can also see the score for each of the 5 rights. The score for right to education is 80.2%, which means the government of Mozambique is doing 80.2% of what it is actually capable of doing. And this 100% is what we measure is possible for a country at the income level of Mozambique to do. There are 2 reasons why this income adjusted benchmark is important. First is the progressive realization that we spoke about. And secondly, a government may say that, well, we could do better on, let's say, the right to education if we had more resources. Hermes score basically shows us that even at the existing level of income, if the country is using its income optimally to ensure or fulfill people's rights. We can also see that there are general indications of performance right at the bottom of each of these scores. Let's scroll down. There is a summary statement that helps us read these scores the way I just explained them to you. We'll go further down. We have a section which is called full details. So now if you would want to understand better about Mozambique scores or about how any country is performing on any particular right, you can go to this particular section. So we'll stick to the right to education. You can see the score for right to education for Mozambique here, which is 80.2%. And then you also see that this particular score on right to education is a cumulative score, or is a score on the basis of 3 component rights, which is the right to primary education, the right to secondary education, and quality education. Now, I think one of the first things we will observe here that the right to primary education for Mozambique, the score is income adjusted 100%. I'll just take a few seconds to explain this. This does not mean that all primary school age children are enjoying their right to education in Mozambique. However, this definitely means that the government of Mozambique is doing everything within its power, within its income and resources or it's using its resources efficiently in order to ensure that primary school age children can enjoy their right to primary education. However, we also see here that the score for secondary education and general education is significantly lower as compared to the right to primary education. Now, for anybody who's interested in working on the right to education, either in Mozambique or generally, this would be an interesting area to explore as to why there are discrepancies in terms of government's performance for the right to primary education and secondary education. If you would like to know more about how we calculate these rights, the rights tracker is very interactive. You can just click on the particular right, and you on the right hand side of your page, you will see a pop-up that can basically help you define the particular right, the indicator data that was used to measure this right, as well as other details that can help you understand these rights better. You can also switch to indicator value to understand what particular indicator data was used in order to arrive at this particular score. As we scroll down, we also have economic and social rights data disaggregated by, disaggregated. Just give me a minute, please. So we also have data on 3 economic and social rights that are disaggregated by sex: the right to education, the right to food, and the right to health. Here also you can see that how well government of Mozambique is performing to ensure the right to education for its female population as compared to other governments compared to other states who are in the same income bracket. And similarly, we can also see how well the government of Mozambique is performing for its male population to fulfill their right to education as compared to other countries in the same income bracket. I will quickly scroll down. We have what we call the overtime graph, and it's an interesting aspect of the Hermi data. We just spoke about progressive realization, which is actually the duty to do better over time. And this graph really helps us visualize whether or not a country is making progress. While we see that the government of Mozambique is overall at a 72.2%, which is lower and definitely there's a room for improvement there. We can also see that the graph is slowly and steadily moving upwards from 2017 to 2020. Just excuse me for a minute. I believe my internet is not aiding us at the moment. You can use this drop-down menu right here in order to look at these overtime graphs for all the different rights and the component rights that we measure. So you can see not only the graphs for the right to education, but you can also see it for the right to primary education, right to secondary education, and that really helps us see whether a country is making any significant improvement or whether it's stagnating or whether it's actually not doing that well. I'll just quickly talk about another interesting aspect of the Hermi data. For the countries where we run our expert survey, we often ask local human rights experts which particular groups of people are at risk of having their economic and social rights violated as well. So if you look at the screen right now, you may see word clouds with certain people groups. Now, these groups of people are actually those that were identified by local experts from Mozambique as being at risk for not being able to enjoy their right to education. We have these word clouds for all the 5 economic and social rights we measure, and you can use the drop-down menu here to switch between rights. You may see that some groups are mentioned in a bigger font, which means that more number of people identified them to be at risk. And then we also have certain qualitative data where these local experts give us more context and details about the violations of these rights, perhaps which geographic areas are more vulnerable, or what are the other reasons that may be responsible for these people not being able to enjoy a particular right. Another interesting feature of the rights tracker is that all our Hermi scores are basically comparable between countries. And this comparison is important because if a country sometimes sees that a country that it considers itself comparable is doing well, it may incentivize the country to do better. I'll just stop sharing my screen and share it again in order to show you that. You can go on the rights menu right here and select. You can go on the rights menu here and basically look at any of the different rights that we measure. And you may find a list of countries for which we have the scores that are arranged in the descending manner of their performance. And that country comparison becomes very important in order to push governments to do better. All these rights that we have, the comparisons that we have between rights, can also be sorted by different regions by adding a country filter. So you can see how countries are doing comparatively based on the different regions and sub-regions, based on treaty ratifications, based on their income assessment standards, etc. I think I will stop sharing my screen here and we can move on with going ahead with the conversation with that particular background. So I think now that we've had a rights tracker tour, it would be interesting for me to first invite Susan, our economic and social rights metrics lead, to speak more about what's new in the data and what were some of the trends that she has observed through the new economic and social rights data. Hi, Susan. So glad to have you here. So to begin with, what are the new additions to Hermes economic and social rights data this year?
First of all, I'm delighted to be here. There's really this year 2 new indicators of note that I wanted to point out that we are using that we haven't had before. First, when we look at high income countries and in particular adult health, what we find is that their greatest challenges tend to revolve around the health of older adults. So what we have done is we have substituted the survival rate of 60 to 80-year-olds for what we used before, which was the survival rate of 15 to 60-year-olds, as our primary underlying indicator for adult right to health for high income countries. So that's one notable change. Second change is we have always felt that quality of education mattered in low and middle income countries. But until now, we haven't been able to incorporate that indicator. Now, this is not because there's no tests that are administered by countries, by low and middle income countries on the right to education. There are many tests. The problem is those tests differ so that we could not find a large number of countries that were administering the same test. However, fortunately, in the last few years, a number of academics, along with the World Bank, have worked to come up with a way to compare those different tests. So what we say is that they've harmonized the test scores so that they are comparable between countries. And so as a result, we are now able to take a look at quality of education as well as access to education in low and middle income countries.
That's very interesting, Susan. I think as a user of the rights tracker, another thing that I have noticed is that the data range that we had for economic and social rights was somewhere between 2007 to 2019. Has the data range been extended this year?
Yes, actually, we've extended it in both directions. So in terms of moving forward, the most recent year's data we have is the data for 2020. And yes, I wish it were for 2023, but in fact, the underlying indicators are not available from the international sources broadly for most countries. That's usually about 2 years behind. So we had the most recent data that could be downloaded as of January this year. And that's what we use to compute our scores. So 2020 is our most recent year. So that's 1 more year than we had before. But in addition, what we have done quite differently this year is we have extended the data range backward quite a bit, so that now on the rights tracker, we have data running from the year 2000 to 2020, which means we have a potential 20-year time series, assuming the country has the data covering that whole period. And that really is useful for enabling us to see trends, to see if there's longer run trends where you might have a fairly short run fluctuation in some indicator value. You might actually over the longer run have very dominant upward or downward trends. And so that will enable us to see that. Actually, we have extended the data further on our download data set. And for those researchers that are curious, they can get a 30-year trend. So we've extended it back to 1990.
That's very fascinating. And I think you're right. In the last 2 decades, a lot has happened and a lot has changed. I think the most recent phenomenon that affected all of us was COVID-19. So could you tell us a little more about that? Where was the impact of COVID-19 probably the highest?
Well, given that our most recent year is 2020, we're just beginning to see the impact of the pandemic. And where it's very obvious right now is on the right to health. Even after we adjust country income for any declines in income as a result of the pandemic, we are seeing that practically across the board, not 100%, but for the vast majority of countries, we are seeing a decrease in our adult health component of the right to health. So, and that's true for low and middle income countries as well as high income countries. Now, there are exceptions, okay, and some of those exceptions are pretty interesting. So I think we've all heard that New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, 3 high-income countries, managed to do quite well in the pandemic. Well, it also turns out that there's some low and middle-income countries that did quite well. So Botswana and Cyprus are 2 examples of that. On the sort of negative side, we all know that Italy, the United States, the United Kingdom did pretty darn poorly. And yes, our data do show steep declines in their adult health scores. But it's also the case that there were some low and middle income countries that had very serious declines. And among those are Colombia and Azerbaijan. There's other ones as well. You can kind of look at the data and sort those out. Obviously, much of this difference is a reflection of the different policies that countries use to try to combat COVID. And it really behooves us to try to investigate these more thoroughly.
That's very interesting. So I think I just noticed that you mentioned when we spoke about the longer series that you were able to identify certain longer running trends. Could you speak more about that? What were certain gains? What were certain pending enduring challenges?
Well, this really differs quite substantially by region or income class. But let me look at the region that had the greatest challenges, and that's sub-Saharan Africa. And what we see there that is really a bright spot is persistent long-run improvement in right to health scores in every country. Now, this just doesn't mean that their percent of kids enjoying that have the percentage of children that survive to age 5 or the percent adults that survive to a particular age doesn't just mean that those have increased. It means that they've increased faster than their capability with income growth has increased. So that's truly a bright spot. Additionally, sub-Saharan African countries have shown substantial gains in ensuring the right to water and sanitation. And these are the key elements of the right to housing that we measure for low and middle income countries. It's not just broadly health improvements, but I'd say across the board for all countries, we have seen, especially low and middle income countries, very substantial gains in child health. And that indeed is very encouraging.
So if we were to look at the right to education, because we just discussed it, based on the findings, what trend do we see? Which countries are doing better? Which countries are not doing that well?
Well, this area has certainly posed a greater challenge than the right to health. While many low and middle income countries have expanded access, progress has been a bit uneven, especially with regard to secondary school. Further, our new education data show that there's a tendency for countries to either focus on expanding access or improving quality. So for example, we see in Peru, high scores, over 95%, both in access to primary and secondary education. So they're doing about as much as their resources will allow there. However, if we look at the quality score is only 54%, and that's really quite a dreadful score. Similarly, in Peru, we see basically the same thing. In Nepal, we see basically the same thing. Great scores on access to primary and secondary education, dreadful scores on the quality of education. But other countries do it the other way. So for example, if we look at Kenya, its score on the quality of education is over 95%, which we classify as good performance. But actually, its score on access to even primary education is in the very bad range. So one's kind of hard pressed to find countries that have done well on both dimensions. So for high income countries, I'd say more generally that the challenge has been in ensuring better quality of education. Access is not so much a problem, but for some countries, it still is indeed quite a problem.
So if we were to sum up the trends that we've seen in the new data, we spoke about the longer trends, but for this particular year, what were certain bright spots? And what do you reckon are some of our biggest challenges?
If we're summing up our biggest challenges, overall, I would say for, well, the bright spots, let's say, if I look overall, low and middle income countries or look overall high income countries, what I find is the best performance in 2020 was observed for the right to food, surprisingly, perhaps surprisingly, and second came the right to health. Having said that, that doesn't mean that every region found they performed best on the right to food. Actually, for South Asian countries, the right to food poses one of the biggest challenges. In terms of more broadly, what the biggest challenges are, I would say that in general, for low and middle income countries, it's focused on the right to education. Whereas for high income countries, the biggest challenge is really with regard to right to work, and in particular, access to work with a decent wage.
Thank you for sharing these findings, Susan. They are very insightful. I think it is particularly intriguing that we saw how different challenges face countries with different income levels. And I believe these income levels become an important part of the conversation because a lot has been said recently about economic and social rights on the one hand and economic growth on the other. So it's interesting that we are leading into that now. And I think I will now invite Elizabeth to speak to us about that, about why there's an either or, and to help understand this better. So Liz, thank you for being here. I'll just start off with the either or question. Could you help us understand why economic and social rights, or human rights generally, and economic growth have received so much attention of late?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. So to answer that question, recently the High Commissioner on Human Rights has actually talked about the human rights economy. And so it's pretty well acknowledged that human rights and economic factors are interlinked. But one of the big questions that keeps popping up is exactly how. And so the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as has already been discussed, right, requires countries to devote their maximum available resources to progressively realize economic and social rights. And this formal commitment has actually often led to improvements in economic and social rights over time. But it's also the case that some policymakers are concerned that focusing on human rights actually comes at the cost of decreased growth. And so in some countries, like the United States, where I'm based, this has also sort of evolved into this political opposition to ESG, or environmental social governance frameworks. And the basic argument is that prioritizing anything other than the bottom line, such as say like the education or the health of the workforce, inherently lowers profit and therefore will lead to lower economic growth in terms of GDP as well.
So it's interesting, but where does this concern come from? And from whatever your findings are, do you think these concerns are valid?
Yeah, so I think it comes from a little bit of that language of the ICSCR. So because it requires prioritizing economic and social rights first, there is at least some reason that people may be concerned that the steps that are taken to fulfill economic and social rights are actually in direct conflict with the steps that would improve economic growth, and vice versa, right? So for example, in the economics literature, it's well established that technological innovation is essential for economic growth. And one of the ways that often occurs is that governments invest highly in higher education. But what that means is they have less resources to then invest in broader access to education for everyone, right? So in that case, the right to education and improving economic growth would sort of be in conflict. But on the other side of it, there's also some evidence that they could be mutually reinforcing. So for instance, policies that prioritize broad access to education or say access to healthcare, those inherently get at those rights to education and health in particular. But it's also the case that they have the potential to benefit businesses and additionally the broader economy, because a more educated, healthy workforce is inherently more productive. And so where we are right now is we're at this place where there's a lot of potential theoretical connections between economic and social rights and economic growth. And we really need to turn to that empirical evidence to inform, what we're actually seeing on the ground. And as of right now, that empirical evidence is still pretty inadequate. And so we should be using data in order to sort of see what's really going on with the connections between the two.
So Liz, how do you think can we use data actually to sort of better inform these relationships that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so one example is a brief analysis that we did where we were actually trying to look at the connection between economic and social rights and economic growth. And we used the newest data that was just introduced from Hermy. We specifically focused on the income adjusted quality of life scores, as well as the 5 individual indicators of the rights to education, health, housing, food, and work. And we combined those scores with data from the World Development Indicator, so publicly available data there too, that measured GDP per capita annual growth rates. And we used an already established methodology in the economics literature. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly to sort of show what this looks like. So we broke countries up into 4 different groups based on 2 dimensions, right? So on the left here, we have how they performed on ESR, and I'm using the right to housing as just one example of how we could do this. And then on the top, we have how they did on GDP per capita growth. And we compared country performance to the median for all countries that we actually had data for. And so if a country was performing above the median on this right to housing and also above the median on GDP per capita growth, we classified that country as virtuous, right? So this is the best case scenario. They're doing well on both of these dimensions. The opposite is where they're doing below the median on their ESR score and also below on growth. And we called that vicious, which would be the worst case scenario. For countries that did well on ESR scores, but less well on growth, we call those housing lopsided, or more generally ESR lopsided. And then for countries that do the opposite, where they have relatively high growth rates, but then lower ESR fulfillment, we call those growth lopsided. And so what we did was we took the data for 2010 and we put all of the countries that we had data for in one of these 4 quadrants. And then we look at where they ended up 10 years later in 2020, which is the newest data that we actually have available.
That is fascinating. So just for people who are viewing us right now, could you tell us more about what these data exactly show us?
Yeah, so I'm going to show you the results for the right to housing scores in particular. So the sort of first thing that you see here is we have this big red bubble in the virtuous category with the 44% in it. And the way that we read this figure is for countries that started out in the virtuous category in 2010, 44% of them remained in that category 10 years later in 2020. Another 44% of them transitioned from the virtuous category in 2010 to the housing lopsided category in 2020. And so notice the arrow going from the virtuous to the housing lopsided quadrant. 3% of them moved from virtuous to vicious, and then another 8% moved from virtuous to growth lopsided. And so this general pattern that we see for countries that started off in the virtuous quadrant here, we see something very similar when we look at countries that started off in the vicious category. So here, right, 51% of countries that started in the vicious category in 2010 remained in that category in 2022. 5% moved from the vicious category to housing lopsided. 3% went from vicious to virtuous, and then 41% went from vicious to growth lopsided. And so the general pattern that we see here is that for countries that started either in the virtuous category or in this vicious category down here, we tend to see that they're likely to stay there. And so one of the things that this implies is that when a country falls into this vicious category, this bad category, it's actually really difficult to escape. But on a more positive note, if they're able to make it to this virtuous category, then the benefits are likely to be enduring, at least for this 10-year time period that we're looking at. And the other thing that this sort of shows us is the paths that countries take to different quadrants. And so if we look at countries that started in the growth lopsided category here, so 48% of them remained in that category 10 years later. 36% of them transitioned from the growth lopsided category to vicious, 10% went to housing lopsided, 5% to virtuous. And so we see this very clear pattern with countries that started in the growth lopsided category. They're either likely to stay there or they're likely to transition to this vicious category, right? Very few of them actually go into housing lopsided or virtuous. And so what this sort of implies is that in the absence of ESR fulfillment, maintaining rapid economic growth is actually quite difficult, right? We see that many countries actually end up transitioning to this bad category down here without the ESR fulfillment. But on the other hand, if we look at countries that started off as housing lopsided, right, 59% of them stay in that category. Another 30% transition to the virtuous category. 5% go to growth lopsided, and 5% go to vicious, right? So again, this is a really clear pattern in the data that we're seeing where countries that start in this housing lopsided category, they either remain there or they transition to this virtuous category. Very few of them are moving to growth lopsided or to vicious. And so what we take from that is that countries that actually do a better job of fulfilling their obligations under international law, they tend to enjoy a growth benefit in the next decade. Or in other words, right, the path to this good category of virtuous seems to go through, right, this ESR fulfillment here. And so just before I stop sharing my screen, I want to point out that this is the data specifically using the right to housing scores, but we did this for all 5 of the ESR scores and the overall quality of life score. We also actually looked at different time periods as well. And we found that these patterns are actually robust across all of those different analyses. So this is sort of a very strong result that we're seeing here. So I'll just stop sharing for a minute.
So Liz, if we were to quickly sum this up in terms of where this leaves us, how can we continue to use data to keep learning more about this?
Yeah, I mean, so the results are really promising here. And I think what they show is there doesn't really appear to be this conflict between economic and social rights and growth that people are concerned about. And actually, rather, they're mutually reinforcing, right? So they work together in this positive way. And so given a lot of the current conversations around ESG, but also these broader concerns about prioritizing human rights over growth, there's at least some evidence that maybe these concerns are a bit overblown. But it also shows that the best path to that virtuous category, right, where countries are doing really well on both economic and social rights fulfillment and growth, is occurring by prioritizing economic and social rights over growth itself. I guess what's still missing from this is the mechanisms through which that occurs, or the specific steps that countries actually have to take in order to get to this positive outcome. But that's actually where Hermes data can be really useful. In addition to showing these broad patterns in the data, right, it can point out specific country cases where we could dig into policy prescriptions that lead us to those good outcomes. It can also help us look at some of the more disaggregated factors so we can really learn as much as possible about the relationships we're seeing here.
Thank you so much for that, Liz, and for basically showing us that economic growth and human rights can be mutually reinforcing. I think what better way of taking this to our special invited guest, Brian, now, because potential for economic growth would be an important factor to really incentivize investments, particularly in lower income countries. So, Brian, welcome, and we are very glad to have you with us today. I think
thank you. Apologies. So let me just share my screen. I'd like to bring you through a few slides. First of all, thank you very much to Hermie for the invitation to discuss the new data set. We at the World Bank have been working with Hermie over the past 2 years or so on economic and social rights, and really try and understand the relevance of this data set for investors. So let me see. Okay. So I've 3 screens, so hopefully I'm sharing the right screen. Yes, I think you can see the presentation. So yeah, so this or these slides broadly draw on a paper that we recently collaborated with Hermie on, and Susan and colleagues at Hermie were also involved. So it's really showing investors how this data set can be used by them in their investment process and how it can really be operationalized. For the World Bank, our work on economic and social rights follows on from our previous research. So the World Bank have been doing a lot of work on ESG investing in sovereign debt. And our previous research highlighted lack of clarity around sovereign ESG frameworks, difficulty with measuring investment impact, and concerns around an ingrained income bias. So this bias affects many of the metrics currently used by the market. So there's a very strong correlation with a country's income. So if investors are using these data sets to invest, they're really going to bias against the countries, the lower income countries that really need this financing most. So this on the right, you can just see your recent paper, and I encourage people to check out the analysis in more detail. But we highlight that this data set is relevant for all sovereign debt investors. So those who are just engaging normally in sovereign debt, but also those implementing an ESG framework of some description. And there's many different types of ESG frameworks. So following on from Liz's very nice overview, and there was some fascinating insights there, and I think it's an area that deserves much more research. On this slide, we assume there is this mutually reinforcing connection between economic and social rights and a country's growth potential. You can see on the right, we have a graph that shows economic and social rights graphed against sovereign credit ratings. So sovereign credit ratings are one of the key metrics used by financial market participants, and a key driver of capital. So you can see this very strong correlation for the higher income countries, but then for the lower income countries, the trend line is actually flat or even negative. So really saying that economic and social rights don't seem to really drive any sort of the credit assessment for lower income countries, which is surprising if we have this thesis that economic and social rights are very important for a country's growth potential. So to us, that would indicate that maybe credit rating methodologies should look to bring in some of these metrics more explicitly into their methodologies. Another perspective on this is a graph of the economic and social rights scores versus the current bond spreads in the market. So this is the MB spread. So it's the cost of borrowing for around 75 countries in external bond markets. So borrowing in euros, borrowing in dollars. So you can see that for there's a concentration of countries in the top left. So these are kind of the countries with relatively stable macroeconomic conditions, etc. But then there is a significant number of countries with their spreads above 600-700 basis points. So this is a cost of borrowing 600-700 basis points above US Treasuries. So 11, 12, 13%. So extremely challenging borrowing conditions for these countries. But even for these countries, you can see quite a disparity in their economic and social rights performance. So to us, for these investors active in these markets, looking and analysing the economic and social rights data could provide kind of this insight into a country's longer run sustainability. Another issue I wanted to touch upon is the complexities of human rights for investors. So most investors are not experts in human rights. When we hear human rights, we normally think about news headlines and civil and political issues, and it's not really economic and social and cultural issues. And many of the frameworks and the ways that investors currently treat human rights, it's kind of pretty unidimensional. So, like for example, exclusion mandates are very much in vogue, where an investor may just look at a country's civil and political rights and then exclude countries not meeting certain indicators. But the graph here on the right shows an illustration of civil and political rights versus economic and social rights. So I think what we can see in the graph is quite a scatter, and we can see many countries in the top right who are performing well in economic and social rights, performing well in civil and political rights. But equally, we can see many countries who are performing well on economic and social rights, but not performing too well in civil and political rights. So if we think of this MB universe, which is the main investment benchmark for investors in sovereign debt, nearly 40% of the universe is in this quadrant. So it's a very challenging issue for investors to have kind of clear investment objectives and theses on what is the most important aspects. Is it civil and political? Is it economic and social? So the issues are complex. So I think investors are still very much struggling with having a clear framework for these issues. Like some investors will place human rights issues in their ESG frameworks. Some investors actually treat them completely separate to ESG frameworks. So there's no kind of common approach at the moment. Another area, and the final one I will cover, is on measuring investment impact. So this is a nascent area in ESG investing. Much of the focus of ESG investing has been on risk management, less on trying to attribute your investments in some way to measure your impact. So there's kind of discussions in the investment community on adding additionality from your investment, so that your investment actually has a stated impact that wouldn't have happened otherwise, or this just measuring like your investment having some positive outcome. So this is an example which I won't go through in detail, but it basically compares a country with similar scores, similar income levels, and it kind of shows how the data set could be used to really understand how many additional people will gain access to education or clean sanitation from your investment. So this particular example, you can see there's roughly 1 million extra people or 1.5 million extra people with access. So for investors, they're still really in the early stages of working on a framework to really explain this impact to end asset owners and to their investment trusts, etc. So maybe just to conclude, our work on ESG in general and sustainability indicates that investors, it's still an area of considerable uncertainty, and investors are still really working on understanding what sustainability means. We at the World Bank see economic and social rights as being a very important part of sovereign sustainability for all the reasons we've discussed today. And we're fully supportive of working with academics, working with investors to try to understand these data sets in more detail and how they can really be operationalized. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for those insights. And actually, that leaves a lot of food for thought. I think we're running out of time now, but if I were to call back all of our panelists for just a quick concluding question of how, what are their hopes for human rights measurement or for people to use data to improve their economic and social rights, perhaps we could go with Susan first, followed by Liz, and then Brian.
Okay, well, what I'd like to see is by 2030, we have stimulated a robust competition between countries to see who can outcompete each other on ensuring economic and social rights.
Yeah, I agree. But one of the things I think we would also be really useful is that we use the data to inform where some of our gaps still are. So the new Hermes data, right, has lots of new details about quality of education and different impacts on health for different age groups. But one of the areas where we still don't have a lot of information is on children's rights. And so if we can use the data to sort of figure out what those gaps are and try and fill those gaps, that would be really useful. It's actually one of the reasons that we're trying to get the child rights work stream to the ground here at Hermes as well.
And from my side, very briefly, I think for investors to have a clear articulation on how human rights issues can be encompassed in the investment process, I think it's still very ad hoc and no real common framework. So I think that's something that we all need to work on and kind of try to articulate better.
Thank you so much to all three of you for really unpacking a lot of complex issues. I think this just goes on to show that human rights data can actually be used beyond advocacy by a wide range of stakeholders who really play a vital role in, our everyday lives and shaping global decisions. With 1 or 2 minutes to go, I would just like to mention that we unfortunately will not be able to take any questions. However, you can feel free to write to us or get in touch with us anytime, and we are more than happy to help you in using our data in your own work. We will be putting email addresses of our focal points in the chat box. We also have several recorded workshops on our YouTube channel in different languages. So please feel free to make use of all those resources. You can also follow our work on our social media or subscribe to our occasional email newsletter. Before we bring this webinar to a close, I would like to reiterate the very significant gratitude that the Hermes team has, first towards our panelists today, and also towards all our researchers, partners, our ambassador community, and the human rights practitioners around the world for their very valuable and selfless work, sometimes in the most difficult circumstances. The work that we do is not possible without your support, your active involvement, and your contribution. So we take every opportunity, and we mean it, that we really value the partnership that we have with you, and we hope that the data we have continues to help your work and to improve the lives of people around the world. So with that, we bring this webinar to a close. Thank you once again.